I hope you can hear me. I can't reach the mic. Welcome, everyone, to the brand new NYU Washington, D.C. building. This is our first event for the 2014 year. We are the NYU Stern School of Business D.C. Alumni chapter. We have a great audience tonight for today's event, Co-Founders and Startups, What Makes a Successful Team. We have Stern and NYU alums from 15 business school chapters in DC, and entrepreneurs from the DC area community. Welcome to all of you. I cannot believe I'm on my tippy toes. My name is Carolyn Chen. I'm Stern 2007, and I'm part of the volunteer planning committee for the DC chapter. There are 8 of us on the committee, and if all of you guys could stand. Leifia, Pratt, Tara, Mike, Dana, and Lisa and Sheldon are not here. And yes, we're always looking for more volunteers, so please speak to them. We represent over 800 Stern alumni here in the DC area. I'd like to thank NYU Washington, DC and Stern Alumni Affairs for sponsoring this event, all the business school chapter leaders that helped promote this event, and of course, Professor Greenberg and panelists Mike and Phil for taking the time out of their schedule to speak with us today about entrepreneurship. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to invite Jamie up from Duke's Fuqua School of Business to make a quick announcement on an upcoming event.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to do a quick plug for an event that Duke Fuqua and Duke DC is doing. It's called A Rare Look Inside the Defense Industry with former Undersecretary of Defense Ken Krieg. Mr. Krieg was the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, so there is a bit of a tie-in with entrepreneurship here tonight. And he's going to be talking about the impact of the current budgetary and political environment on the aerospace, defense, and government services industry. This event's going to take place on Thursday, February 6th in the evening, starting at 6:30 p.m. It'll happen in Arlington, Virginia. If you have any questions, please come see me. I think you'll be able to identify me with my bright green sweater on, and I hope to see many of you there. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Jamie. Without further ado, about tonight's speakers. I met Jason Greenberg last year at the Kauffman Foundation Life Sciences Summit in San Francisco, where I heard his presentation on co-founders. His insights were not only enlightening and informative, but it really hit home for me as a biotech entrepreneur in the conference. 1 year in the making and plus a new baby, Jason is finally here. Jason Greenberg has been Assistant Professor of Management at the Stern School of Business since 2010. His research focus includes economic and organizational sociology, social networks, and entrepreneurship. He has investigated how social networks have a bearing on the structure, functioning, and performance of entrepreneurial founding teams. His current work includes research on crowdfunding with a Wharton professor and the value of alternative job search channels for initial MBA placement. Prior to Stern, Professor Greenberg was a research fellow at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard and a research fellow at the Departments of Computer Science and Poli-Sci at Northeastern. He has also worked as a specialist clerk on the floor of the American Stock Exchange, as a management consultant specialized in organization and employee research, and has also advised several startups with organizational, strategic, and human capital issues. And somewhere in his spare time, he has helped found and manage several family-owned businesses. Professor Greenberg received his BA from SUNY Binghamton, master's degrees from the University of Florida and the University of Chicago, and his PhD in management from MIT. On to our panelists. Mike Chan is an entrepreneur, consultant, blogger, and teacher. He is the founder and principal of MWC Consulting, a marketing and strategy consulting firm that helps startups and small businesses grow. He is heavily involved in the tech startup world as a founder, advisor, and co-organizer of Startup Weekend DC. He blogs at mikewchan.com and for the Consumer Electronics Association. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and was formerly the senior director of strategic marketing for the Washington Capitals. He holds a BA from Lehigh University, a master's from Georgia Tech, and an MBA from Stern. Phil Rosenthal is the president and co-founder of FastCase, a leading online legal research software company based here in DC. After 14 years with a successful co-founding relationship, FastCase has grown to one of the world's largest legal publishers and the #1 provider of online legal research benefits to bar associations around the country. Before founding FastCase, Phil worked at Covington and Burling in DC, where he assisted in the development of one of the first digital wireless cable systems. Phil holds a BA from Yale, JD from Harvard, and master's and PhD degrees from Caltech. Please help me give a very warm welcome on a very cold night to Jason, Mike, and Phil.
So thank you, Caroline, for the invitation, very warm introduction. And thank you all for braving the frigid weather tonight to join us here. We're going to talk about what makes for a successful founding team. But before doing so, I wanted to give you a brief update about what's going on in terms of entrepreneurship at NYU. So today, more than 100 classes in entrepreneurship are taught at NYU. For those of you that have graduated relatively recently, this still means that Glenn Oken is probably your professor. He's teaching some inordinate number of classes. I just found out that 845 patents were issued to NYU faculty and students, and 82 startups came out of those patents, that sort of innovation. NYU is a co-partner with the New York Economic Development Corporation in 3 different incubators that have helped 106 companies raise $65 million. 5 of the companies have already been acquired. These companies have produced 900 jobs and about $250 million in economic impact for the New York area. So entrepreneurship and innovation is alive and well and thriving at NYU. We have a $20 million seed fund that has thus far funded 8 startups, primarily in the life sciences, therapeutic companies in particular. And for all of you, I want to direct you to this Made by NYU. Some of you have seen like the Made in New York label or the Made in Brooklyn. So now we have Made by NYU. And this lists all of our startup exemplars. And I invite all of you to look at the site and add your information as applicable. I also heard that there are going to be some Wharton folks in attendance. Could you raise your hand? So I contacted my co-author, Ethan Malik. We work on a crowdfunding project, and I asked him for something interesting about entrepreneurship at Wharton. And he sent me this graph here. So the x-axis is jobs post-graduation, and perhaps contrary to some stereotypes, as Wharton is simply a finance shop, there's a lot of entrepreneurship at Wharton. So by the 4th job post-graduation, you see nearly 18.5% going into an entrepreneurial venture. I suspect a lot of them are starting hedge funds, so it still has a finance bent. But there is some entrepreneurship there. And I heard that the last year's graduating class had 8% of the students go into entrepreneurships out of graduation, which is a fairly high rate. It's up there with MIT and quite a few percentage points higher than NYU. So Wharton's doing pretty good. Common Bond, if you're familiar with, raised $100 million in financing, which came out of Ethan's class, incidentally. So Wharton's doing pretty good as well. All right, let's talk about founding teams. And doing so is important because research consistently shows that founding team issues are the primary reason why startups fail. Consistent with this point, a pretty good venture capitalist, Fred Wilson of Union Square, had this to say, and I quote, "No business is so good that the wrong people can't mess it up. And no business is so bad that the right people can't fix it. So if you don't get the people part of the equation right, everything else is really immaterial. Getting the people part right, however, is no easy task. A pretty good scientist had this to say about people. I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Anyone have an idea who said this? No? Heavenly bodies? You're in the right area. Not Galileo, though. One of my favorites. But. Okay.
Oh, that guy.
All right, so what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the madness of people. We're going to bring social science to bear on this, and we have some great first-hand experience to draw on as well. So you heard about Mike's background. He's the founder and principal in a boutique strategy consulting firm. And then you heard about Phil's really interesting background, hard science, but also law as well. To structure this conversation, we're going to focus on these 3 R's. We'll talk about relationships, roles, and rewards. And we'll start off with relationships. So I think there are two ways about thinking about relationships in founding teams. The first has to do with functional considerations. This is about human capital, technical skills. That is what each founder brings to the venture. And the second consideration has to do with social relationships. And there are lots of adages about this, or aphorisms. You've heard about mixing business with pleasure, right? This article here is from the Boston Globe, and it's entitled, "Think Before Mixing Business, Buds, Your Friends, and Blood." And the first sentence reads, "Going into business with friends or family, prepare for disaster." So the thesis is very clear very quickly. This article from entrepreneur.com is entitled "Buddy System," and it extols the virtues of a business with good friends because you have a lot of trust. If we sample on success, we see lots of examples of very successful ventures started by friends or family members. You see here Johnson and Johnson and Johnson, the Johnson brothers. These individuals probably need no introduction here. If you think about Microsoft, you think about Apple, The Gap, they all have founders who were friends or family members before the venture started. So who's right here? Is it a good idea to start a business with friends and family or not? And I'll ask you just to raise your hands here. Who thinks it's a good idea to start a business with family members? Good idea. Okay. What about friends? A little more there. Coworkers? What about strangers? All right, technological startups often include coworkers, right? Friends, and to a much lesser degree, family members. Actually, I want to stop here for a second, and I want to get our panelists involved here. What are your thoughts on this? So you have very different experiences, right? So Mike, can you tell us a little bit about your experience in selecting meeting a co-founder and what your relationship was?
Sure. So I'll talk in my couple of experiences. The first one, I founded a company with strangers. That did not work out very well. Probably a lot of it was my fault, obviously. Just really moved so fast and wanted to go so fast, and that's kind of the mantra for tech startups is go fast, fail fast, and that's exactly what we did. Bring together a bunch of people who just didn't really know how to work together. That was the first failure of my first startup.
How did you meet the strangers?
Online, basically Match.com for entrepreneurs, which there's a lot of companies are forming that way, and a lot of co-founders are meeting that way. And I thought I was doing a great job meeting people and bringing a team together because I did it so quickly. And little did I know it was not doing a good job. So that's my experience with strangers. But now it's more of a co-worker atmosphere where actually one of my consulting clients I'm working on a startup with, and that so far is going much more smoothly. So I think pretty good on the data, agreeable with that data that you just showed.
And Phil?
Well, my company, I've only been one, fortunately, thank God it's been working so far, is with a coworker. We were at Covington and Burling down the street and just happened to be in the same suite when the idea came. So we didn't pick each other. It's just simply that we started talking late one night and suddenly had this idea, and there we were. So it was both ours right from the beginning. And so what we didn't, even though we were coworkers in the same suite, we weren't close friends. We didn't do things together on the weekends or go to dinner really. So there was a lot still to be worked out, to be sure. But we were coworkers, and so it's been working. It's worked great.
Yeah, so these anecdotes map very well into research that came out of my dissertation. So these are predicted probabilities. The data here are nationally representative. It's a nationally representative sample of 1,214 startups that we tracked for 6 years, from idea conception, literally the moment when they came up with the idea, through 6 years, where at which point many of the ventures succeeded and many more failed. And what the results show, and this controls for 50 other factors, psychological factors, sociological factors, economic factors, is that teams that include coworkers are much more likely to achieve viability. Those that were started by friends who never worked together in the past. You know, your friend that you've been speaking with about opening a bar for many years because you both enjoy drinking at bars and you're good friends, those tend to be the worst. And you can see those with family members tend to perform reasonably well as well. I also want to talk here a little bit about how you date co-founders. And I was thinking about Mike's experience here. So you can think about this online dating mechanism, and there are more and more sites like this. Founder dating is one. Was that the one you happen to have used?
I was on that one in Co-Founders Lab as well.
Yeah, so there are these mechanisms to help you meet people that perhaps have a similar interest but have complementary skills. But the question is, how do you date a co-founder? So Phil had a colleague at work. How do you get into this discussion and assess whether there's someone you actually want to take that next step with and consummate the relationship with in some respects?
Sure. We did, in some ways, we didn't do the standard kind of dating that one probably should do. So many of the issues never got addressed or resolved in the early days. You know, people talk about all the contracts you should have between one another. To this day, we don't have a single one. You know, we never worked out that stuff. On the other hand, after the idea came along, we did probably work together about 9 months in the evenings, on and off, ostensibly to try to figure out the viability of the idea. But along the way, I think we did get to learn important things about each other and the dedication we both had to making this work. So there was at least some period of what one might call dating before we finally left the firm, and that was late '99, and here we are.
So Mike, you got married really quickly, apparently.
Yeah, basically jumped right into it. It's like Vegas. But yeah, that, and again, that didn't end up very well, but I was basically one guy I had a couple phone calls with and got married. One guy I had one physical date with, got married. The other guy apparently was married to one of those guys, and he just came along for the ride. So it was just this just came together, and you know, obviously it didn't end up well, but now I've been working with my co-founder for over a year as a consulting client, and also as co-founder in parallel. And you know, there's been much more of a kind of a test period, a dating period, and you know, we've been pretty open with each other in terms of, you know, we're both running our consulting firm, so we kind of have to balance that as well. So, you know, we've been really honest and open with each other, and that's been really helpful.
So one of the issues that a lot of my students confront out of a business school is that they have a very good, or they believe to be a very good business idea, but they don't have the technical capabilities to execute. It's often in the IT space. And I was wondering if you had any experiences with this, what, you know, so-called lost in translation issues, that there's a tech skill that you require. Perhaps it means giving up equity or a founder title, but you don't know how to communicate that with a potential co-founder. Is this something that you've encountered?
Well, yeah, I mean, we certainly had to go build this legal research system, and even though I'm a former physicist, I wasn't that kind of coder to go do it. So neither one, we were both lawyers. We were in some ways too similar in our backgrounds. So we had to go find the people to do that. And we didn't bring them in as founders. I mean, there was some stock involved. But we had to go find actually, we tried doing some of it offshore at first, and miserable failure. And then we found a CTO. And so we actually had the problems of trying to build the team, but we didn't really do it as co-founders. We kept ourselves as the co-founders.
Yeah, that was the main issue of why I had to build that team in the beginning for my first venture. It's because I couldn't build it. I couldn't build what I wanted to build. So the three other co-founders that I had recruited were technical. They were all software engineers, and you know, that was the absolute sole reason why I did it so quickly. and that turned out to be the sole reason why it didn't work. So yeah, that's definitely a problem that I hear a lot, and a lot of non-technical founders will have to go through that process.
I should note that we'll reserve at least 10 to 15 minutes at the end so that you could ask the panelists questions. For now, I'd like to move on and let's talk about issues of roles here. So I'm going to ask you once again, what is the most important criterion you would think would be important when you determine which of the co-founders is going to assume the title of CEO? So who thinks it's who came up with the idea originally? Show of hands. This is the most important thing in determining which of the co-founders becomes the CEO. Idea? No one? Okay. What about the social relationships? Your good friends will just be co-CEOs. No? What about tech skills? The capacity to build a product. What about funding? A little bit. Business acumen? Stern, right? Social network. We're executing the idea. All right. Very interesting. When I present this to scientists, they're very quick to say it's about money, interestingly enough. So I have to figure out an opportunity for you to meet the scientists, because they do appreciate the ability to execute, the ability to bring product to market. Interesting enough, research shows that the person who comes up with the idea is most often the person who becomes the CEO. And you could think about why this might be the case rhetorically, right? You decide to co-found a business with someone else, and you say, well, I came up with the idea, right? My own research shows that it doesn't necessarily matter who does what as long as the founders are in sync about these things. These are odds ratios. For those of you that are gamblers, this might be a very intuitive metric. It just means the number of times more likely you are to achieve viability. Here it means that if the founders are in sync, they agree who will do what from the onset, they're about 4.5 times more likely to achieve viability. I'm going to skip this so we can get to the questions later. And I want to talk more about reward issues. So let's talk about equity, a very important thing to consider. So there are multiple founders. Who thinks the equity should be split evenly? Show of hands. Who says no? I presume the rest of you? OK. I'd like to talk to you once again about these issues. What were your thoughts about equity? How did you go about discussing this with your co-founder? And also when?
Well, for us, it was pretty easy because our contributions in almost all ways were equal. And so, we came up with the idea at the same moment together, the same capital contribution, the same, similar backgrounds. We both jumped full time at the same time. So, 50-50 done. So I don't have a really exciting case for you there. I mean, that's,
Mike?
We had those conversations early, and I think that was a good thing to have those conversations really early. We didn't necessarily get to the point where we incorporated and doled out equity, but it was just a number of different variables, like who thought of the idea, which was me, and I was CEO, and who can actually, how much time people can dedicate to the project because everyone else has other things to do. Who has connections? So it's always going to be a tough conversation to have because everyone wants kind of to maximize their share of the pie. But we never quite got to the point. But having that conversation really early, and it being one of the most difficult conversations you're probably going to have, if you can get through that, it's good.
Do you have a sense of when you should have this prenuptial discussion with your date?
Oh, what was that?
Let's consider this like, it's in some respects, almost like a prenuptial. And if you're dating very quickly, when do you think would be the right time to talk about who gets what?
I think overall, just as a general rule, have that as early as possible. You don't really necessarily have to carve it in stone, but I think because things always change in the startup, but at least having an idea of where you stand as early as possible is going to be beneficial in the long run.
Here, interestingly, once again, and Mike touched upon this, rhetorically it becomes very powerful when you split up equity to say that I came up with the idea. So what this shows essentially is the premium for people assuming different positions. It's the intersection of two things: who takes on what role, what title, and what amount of equity they get. And then you see the incremental boost they get if they're also the person who came up with the idea. Okay? So what you see in purple is that if that particular person assumed the CEO role, they got a 20% boost in equity simply because they were the person who came up with the idea. So people are giving a lot of equity up simply because someone came up with the idea first. And you could think about why this might be problematic, right? Because ventures often pivot. So the initial idea might not be the one that ultimately proves successful. And Phil touched upon a lot of these things, which maps very much onto the research. So when is equity likely to be split equally? When financial capital investments are the same. I think that was the case in Phil's example. Founders have similar levels of industry experience. Were you in the same cohort at the law firm?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yep. All founders are first-timers.
Yep.
Same thing, right? So you could think about why this makes a lot of sense rhetorically, right? We put in the same. We're starting with the same. Our contribution is the same in terms of human capital, financial capital. Ergo, we should split it up equally, right? Makes perfect sense. The earlier in the process you split the equity, the more likely it's just, it's kind of like a hypothetical thing, right? You don't actually have much of a pie to split. Or it's completely hypothetical. So you say, you take 50%, I'll take 50%. We don't need to argue about this now. Why should we have conflict this early in our relationship? When founders are friends, and this is where that social relational component comes in, it's much more likely that they're going to split it equally because, again, it's hard to have this conversation with a friend that you deserve more of the pie than they do. And then when the team is smaller, this is also more likely. All right, so Phil touched upon this to some extent. He said he still does not have a formal agreement. What do you think? Is that a good idea on average? It's worked for him, right? What do you think? Yes? Good idea? No. Mike, did you have a formal contract?
Nope.
No. My research shows, generally speaking, you should have a formal contract. Not surprising, and here's why. So I suspect many of you know what philosopher said this, right? This is DC. Donald Rumsfeld. This might seem like gobbledygook, but I think there's a lot of important insight here. So I'll give you a second or two to read it. Okay, who wants to summarize? Now, why is this important? It's important because in a startup, there are no knowns. You know at time one what each person has brought to the venture, right? You know their initial financial contribution. There are also known unknowns. You don't know what the final business model will be. You'll likely have to pivot in some respect or another. You know who came up with the original idea. You don't know how much capital you need, but you know that you don't know that, right? There are, however, a lot of things that you don't know. And the issues here are very hard to contract. So you could have static contractual provisions that stipulate the things that you know. How much financial capital someone invests relates to this amount of equity at time one, right? You could include dynamic contractual provisions. These are vesting schedules, cliffs. These are various devices to incentivize your future action based on contributions that you haven't fulfilled yet, but there's some suspicion that you will in the future. The unknown unknowns, now that's a whole different story, right? Because you don't know what they are. So it's hard to put this in any sort of prose. Phil's a lawyer. I love how lawyers write sometimes. You read a contract and it says, from the beginning of time until the end of the earth, these provisions hold. It's really hard, however, to think about splitting up the pie, about something that you have no idea what it is, right? And this comes back to the basic notion of trust. And this is why social relationships matter in this context. You do have to have some sort of belief that your partner isn't going to screw you at the end. So I want to give you some takeaways, and then I want to open it up to questions. and that is that finding the right partner may be the most important first step in any sort of venture, and that requires understanding that this is a dynamic process. It's hard to do this as a very quick shotgun marriage where you know that you need the skill set because you have certain blind spots, so you marry someone very quickly, so to speak. You need to think about these three things, the three R's. That is your relationships, the roles that you each will assume, and the rewards that you get, the equity that you get. And you need to ensure that you're in sync both with respect to who does what, but also what you get for what you do. And remember, you're not only building a product, you're also building an organization, which is a truly marvelous sort of opportunity. You could treat your employees the way you wanted to be treated. So when you have a co-founder, it's very important that you have the same vision for the venture. Don't wait too long to discuss contracts. Sometimes it works. In Phil's case, I suspect because there was a lot of trust with his co-founder. But understand that they're always incomplete, right? Contracts are very much a relational product. The language there will never account for all the contingencies that will likely arise. So you have to think about it as a dynamic thing, and you have to think about it as something that builds off of your relationship with your co-founder. Equity splits, typically equal splits are not the best thing. It seems like they should be, right? You get 50%, I get 50%, we're all happy. But what happens if you end up doing 90% of the work at time two? You're not going to be that happy with that equal split, particularly if it's someone you care about, if it's your friend. You're going to feel like you're getting screwed. So think about this pretty carefully. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'd like to open this up to questions now. There.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm a serial entrepreneur, investor, and mentor to startups, and I certainly agree with a lot of what you've said. Let me just offer one angle. What I see a lot is you have a couple of guys that get together and they play basketball together, went to a bar together, whatever, and the two cardinal things that really kill a lot of startups, and of course the younger the people are, I think the more you see this, especially in their 20s and so forth. One of two things tends to happen. One is, where did my partner go? He and I split the equity, we gave each other equity, we forgot to stage it out over time. We never did an analysis as to he was going to do this, I was going to do that, and how much time were each of us going to spend. So now he's working for Bank of America on the West Coast, and where did he go? The other thing that I see all the time is I wish my partner would go, please, because he's totally incompetent. He's great at basketball, he knows nothing about marketing. So the bottom line is have a little honeymoon, stage out the equity over time, and be careful to get things in writing right away, particularly things like assignment of intellectual property rights from the individuals into the entity. Your classic case, and I've seen this 3 or 4 times in the last couple of weeks, they've got a great program called Startup Chile. And you go down there, you take your backpack, you get $40,000, and you don't have to do much to get it from the government. And all these guys are leaving, going down there, having a wonderful vacation, and stealing the intellectual property before it gets assigned into the company.
So you said that you both had issues with not actually being technical and able to actually create the product that you envisioned. How did you employ the tech people? And was that a problem when you went to get funding for the team? Funding for the people who were going to fund you about the quality of your team?
Sure. Well, the funding was certainly a challenge because we started to look for funding right as the internet bubble burst. And we were a .com content play, so no one wanted that. In terms of finding the technical people, I mean, it's sort of the old-fashioned way in a sense. Well, first, like I said, we tried, a function of also having no money, doing some offshore development for next to nothing, and we pretty much got that. And then we also just, through actually a gentleman on our board recommended someone who he said was a really great developer, and we ended up hiring him. It was just through contacts finding someone who could do it.
So you brought them internally, you didn't outsource that.
Right. And then a bunch more. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, in my situation, I was just out in every tech meetup, networking event, pitching my idea to everyone, to any developer I can pull off the street, and it took a while. It took a few months, and it never quite got to the funding stage. But yeah, I think for a non-technical founder, it's different. I think that was a couple years ago. It's different now. I think, especially in DC, where the tech ecosystem has grown so much so quickly. Now all the developers have their choice of what startup they want to work on, if they want to work on a startup, and it's now you essentially have to show them that you have put a lot of work into your idea, and not just have an idea in your head. So I think it's interesting that the computer science guys, the programmers are the rock stars now in the tech world, and they can just field any kind of offer, and they have the pick.
I should have just added my apologies. We actually started, there was a local company that I don't think they're around anymore, but they did a little prototype for us, and so for funding that was critical, that we at least had something to show, and we paid them a little bit, and the hope was we'd end up working together in the future. But yeah, you do need something to get seed money. Our experience is you first have to virtually have customers.
So it wasn't a problem that you had an outside person doing it for the prototype, that you didn't have an internal tech person before you got one?
Yeah, well, the funding came in drips in the early days.
Okay.
This is more of a comment. I wrote my dissertation on the financing of the independent petroleum industry. And this was, well, I finally finished in '76. I have mostly data from, say, 1970. It wouldn't work today because a lot of institutional things have changed, mostly the tax rates. But your comments, I started thinking back in terms of how I interviewed an awful lot of independent producers. My background, I was originally a petroleum engineer, so I knew the industry from that point of view. But money was not the problem. It's very capital intensive, but the secret was you don't use your money. Two ways. One, the industry is so structured that you have contractors that you can hire on a project basis. You drill a well, you hire a drilling contractor. When you cement and frack it, you hire Halliburton or someone. And for the money, this started out pre-Kennedy, so you had a 94% marginal tax rate. And even afterwards, it was what, 70% still? Something in that range, or more than that, I think. Well, you'd always find that we always used to call them doctors because they had the most money in those days. We'd be very happy to put their money up because, when they're paying 90% tax rate, it only cost them 10 cents on the dollar, and when it hit big. These companies, typically it was the entrepreneur, the guy that put it together, but there's also the other was the geologist, we'll call him the geologist, the guy that had the prospect. Usually he didn't want to be the entrepreneur. Everyone else was sort of, there might be 3 or 4 other people, professional, and that one of which would be the secretary. It's very different from what, the nature of the industry, very big, because you didn't worry about the money side. You each had, by definition, you had your role defined. The geologist found prospects to drill. You also would have a production engineer, he may be a field foreman type guy who ran the rigs, did all the field work. And then, so this is, some of these issues that you bring up, think about, wait a second, these weren't an issue with this in this area. And so it comes out to be the same, it's very different with that, but they work, but you're still addressing some of the same problems. Some were predetermined. Thanks.
Just the same question I would ask the professor. If you mentioned this comes up a lot in your class, idea but no technical ability. What does your research show? What have you learned that you could share as well?
With respect to how to do this dating,
how does a founder who has the idea with no technical ability, what is the ideal circumstance in which to find that person? And maybe if you can, how do you what is the best way to marry? Is it founder or is it contract or what?
Typically through social networks. So I was very interested in hearing Mike's experience. So this is very different than my students' experience. They are very reluctant to share their ideas. So Mike mentioned how he went to tech meetups to try to solicit a co-founder. My students are very concerned about someone poaching their intellectual property, which I think is the wrong way to think about this. If the idea could be stolen that quickly because it's so manifestly good, it's probably not that complicated. There probably aren't that many barriers to entry. So the best way that I found is to work through your social networks. The worst thing to do is to think about the tech talent, particularly if you're thinking about it in the context of giving up equity, as just like a code monkey. So this notion that you're basically just a fungible commodity. I came up with the idea. I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to execute it, but you're not that important. So thinking about how to treat them as an equal participant in this process, and understand now that the ratios are not very favorable in lots of cities. Washington is better than New York. So although the tech scene is burgeoning in New York, it tends to be consumer facing. It tends to be tech light in many respects, if that makes sense. I find this has a bearing on my own research, frankly. A lot of the bigger data projects are very difficult for me to staff because the market is overheated, and any of the undergraduates who could do this kind of work are already commanding pretty significant hourly rates. So a lot of ventures in New York actually outsource, geographically speaking, a lot of the hardcore technical work to the Research Triangle. I've hired people in Arizona to do this sort of work. So think about it very much as a partnership. Think about using your social networks to identify people that you could trust and talk about your ideas with, and have someone vouch for you. It's about social proof. Someone who will say that you're a very good person to work with, and this tech person is very good to work with. You will still confront these issues about loss in translation because you don't fully understand the technical limitations that they're going to confront. But that's something that you have to have that clear level of communication to overcome.
Hi. I actually took place or participated in several startups back in the 90s out in the Valley. It was a fascinating and interesting time. And the question I have for you gentlemen is, as co-founders of these ventures, what percent or how much of your day-to-day guidance is based on set goals or set milestones? How do you know when you've reached a certain place down the line in the business, even early on, that you're on the right track, or that things need to be tinkered a bit in order to continue moving forward? And again, I come from the perspective of having been a marketer and having this technical product, that has been conceptualized, and it's a great idea, but maybe market conditions are such that you're ahead of the market, and how do you account for that? Or maybe the core market that you're trying to target may be going in a different direction. So I guess my basic question is, how do you deal with the day-to-day, and do you have this set plan, the 6-month plan, the 2-year plan that you work by, and what kind of do you do if you don't hit those milestones? Or have you encountered that situation?
A question you didn't quite ask, but so the precursor would also be, how do you even set the milestones? One of the big challenges of the co-founder world, where when you're 50-50 and such. But you know, I don't know that we've been that formal to have the 2-year plan, the 5-year plan. We certainly early on had all the business plans, and you know, those never turned out to be, as often is the case, terribly accurate. But we certainly do have goals for each year, and a strategic meeting every year to try to figure out what we want to do. And things, we freely change course mid-year as the market changes. We try to have some good metrics in place, but I think that's, you know, I don't know if we do anything very unique there. I think the harder challenge almost is, how do you get everything figured out what you want to do when there isn't one clear person?
Yeah. In a very early stage startup, you're basically constantly tinkering. You don't. Professor Greenberg said the importance of finding product market fit, and like you said, if you're too early, you're not going to find that product market fit, and so you're always, you kind of want to set those. All right, let's have the product at a certain point in 2 months, and then test to see what the adoption might be, and then you kind of run some experiments around that. You run some surveys, and so you're always tinkering, and so it's hard to really have this multi-year plan, at least in the very early stages of a startup. And I think that's one of the reasons why having a strong founding team is so important, is because you'll be able to pivot and understand the data that you're getting, and maybe change direction from the original idea to get closer to that product market fit. So I think business plans are essentially out the window. There's other tools like the business model canvas that is a bit more dynamic, that are used in the startup world, that I use as well. And it's just a whole bunch of little experiments that you keep learning from in the early stages, and then you just kind of use that data to point you towards the right direction.
You alluded to surveys. I presume those are for your customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think
potential users, yeah.
That's very important, right? So he's going to the person, the end user, essentially, and that is informing the next experiment, perhaps the pivot. So you're getting constant feedback about what works and what doesn't. I presume Phil does likewise.
Oh yeah, all the time.
Remember, you're producing something that someone else is using, and you should always have them in mind. And if they're happy, then you're probably doing something right. And if they're not, perhaps you have to do something different.
Do you have any thoughts on risks of losing not only your money, but your work friends and non-work friends and family relationships if the business doesn't pan out, and how those risks might be mitigated?
Yeah, it's a risk. Thankfully, haven't quite gotten to the point where I have lost anyone or have people started hating me. But yeah, that's a huge risk. I mean, that's a risk that's obviously worth taking to people who take it, and to entrepreneurs who strike out on their own and try to build a company. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if there's a way to really mitigate that if you're really working towards success. Obviously there are going to be times where you have to still engage with your friends and family, for your sanity. But I mean, it's definitely a risk, but one that's worth taking.
And I think in some ways it's a great risk. I mean, it's a risk. I mean, we took in money from folks who, I'm sure they liked the idea, but they really had faith in us. They were investing in us. And what do you do then? You have to go forward. It's certainly unlike any other job. You can leave a job. You can't leave a company that you founded. And so, I think it's a risk that drove us to success. And it's also a risk to definitely think about in the co-founder relationship, and why I think sometimes people are circumspect about, do you start a company with your best friend? Because sometimes companies don't work, and there'll be different tensions in a company that you don't have in a friendship. And you could lose more than the company. and so I think, it's sort of, welcome to entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, the risks are extremely high in that way. But it's what makes it an interesting challenge, and hopefully some good rewards with it. So.
I'm curious, you use the metaphor marriage a lot. And I was just curious from your research, what type of dynamic in terms of demographic you might use, in terms of, did you find any differences between, in starting something up, whether it was male-male, male-female, especially with coworkers, what's the likelihood of working with male-female in terms of coworkers as opposed to male-male or female-female, and what is the likelihood of success in terms of, let's say, crossing over or having the quote-unquote marriage that you have implied?
It's a good question. There are no differences with coworkers, so male-male, female-female, although those two tend to be more prevalent. That is to say, male coworkers starting a business with male colleagues and women likewise. With family, simply because of the rates of heterosexual marriage, you're going to see them being cross-gendered more often than not, and there are no real noticeable differences either. The real issue is kind of the main effect. The coworkers tend to perform much better than friends you've never worked with, and I think Phil alluded to the intuition behind that. You've had a pretty good opportunity to assess how someone works, whether this is someone who thinks like you, at least in terms about what the business will look like, if it's someone that you communicate with relatively well. With friends, you might have a great social relationship. You might see them every Sunday when you watch a football game, but you've never seen them work. And that entails some of the risks that you made reference to, that when things go bad, you might lose not only the business and the equity, but also your friendship. And I have seen that, frankly. I have a very good friend who's an independent filmmaker. He met one of his best friends in film school, and they've had a very successful business up until this year. Things have gotten rocky, as has their friendship. So these are people that spend basically every day together for the last 15 years, and now they can't stand the sight of each other. So how do you try to mitigate that? And it goes back to these issues about clarity, being very clear about things. When we talked about dynamic provisioning, what we were talking about there is kind of separating it from you versus me and putting out carrots about milestones that people accomplish. If you do this, or I do this, you get that in return. So it's less about me versus you. It's about doing something that furthers the objective of the enterprise. But you never know how people will react to things.
I had a couple of questions. What I found out, I'm a founder of a web-based model. Phil and I spoke about that. And it's similar to Angie's List, Living Social, and Groupon. And what I have found is, we've all heard opposites attract, physics, but actually like sticks together. So my web-based model is called I Do, I Don't Worldwide, and it's based on divorce. And it's a model whereby you get divorce discounts. Providers are matched with members. So in your example, Phil, you had a like with your partner. He was an attorney, same law firm. I don't know if you've had that experience, and that's the reason why your marriage is dissolved, if you will. I'm finding, I'm bringing on a co-founder now, who is also divorced, wonderful female, multi-millionaire company that she had with her husband prior, and our prenuptial agreement in marriage is coming to fruition. Any comments?
Interesting. Well, my co-founder and I are actually extremely different. Both lawyers, but Ed is a from Baton Rouge, he would describe his in some ways a beer and softball practice. He did a lot more than that, But I was this Jewish kid from the Bronx doing physics. I mean, extremely different. We have a saying in the company that if the two of us agree, it has to be wrong. We disagree about everything, and I don't know if I misunderstood you. We haven't dissolved. I mean, we're still running the company. So I do think the oppositeness is in some ways a strength, and it certainly has kept us moderated somewhere down the middle. It's led to challenges on decision making, certainly, because we do disagree about many things. But again, I think it's been positive for us, and the shared, just a thought on the marriage point. Also, it's got all the talk about that's gotten me thinking about arranged marriages in a way, and why do they often seem to work when it makes no sense to most of us in the room probably, but they all statistically I've heard they do. You need this shared. Maybe you're not quote unquote compatible, liking the same things, having the same ideas, but the shared values and commitment to making sure the kids do okay, and that is I think a lot of what you got to find in a co-founder. Is someone who's going to make sure it works no matter what, no matter how much you're arguing about things, whatever it is. So I think you're right, that a lot of the differences help.
We'll take one last question.
One business leader I've spoken with said you should start your business plan or go into it figuring out what your exit plan is. And how important do you think that is? Do you all have exit plans?
This is another place where we do it all wrong, right? Because we've consciously tried not to focus on the exit plan because at least when we started, again, it was internet bubble time, and I can't tell you how many investor, VC types would come to us and say, here's what you do. You gotta do Bolivian law, and so, I've never been there, But no, we'll do this and we'll flip it in 18 months. And it's like, I want to build a company. I don't know anything, and so we actually tried not to focus on the exit. So we'd focus on sort of the old-fashioned, how do we get profits? And the exit, I don't know, it'll be a thriving company, and we'll do whatever we do with it then. And so it's a different, we do think about that because we have investors, and we have to think about how we're going to get them a good return. But we build the company from the point of view of pointing towards an exit in the same way.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it. I just think that with the founding team, you need to agree on what it is, because if one of them wants super hyper growth and to sell within 3 years, the other guy wants to build a lasting business, profitable business. That's just not going to work. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. Starting with the exit and then going backwards, it's just make sure you're on the same page with whatever decision you come to.
On that note, we're going to close. We're going to just thank the speakers. Actually, give them a round of applause while we're doing this. Hello? Oh, here you go.
So I just wanted to thank, on behalf of NYU Stern and the Alumni Board in DC, Professor Greenberg, Phil, and Mike for coming out and spending the time to share some thoughts with us. And we have some gifts for you guys. So once again, a round of applause for the panelists and Professor Greenberg.
And thank you all for all your questions. My understanding is we'd have some food and some beverages. So please feel free to ask any of us for any advice or pose any more questions you'd like that haven't been answered yet. Thank you.
And also a quick plug for the NYU Stern kids in the room, or not just kids, I guess. I still think of it.